There's an old school Hebrew version of the book of Esther that goes clear back to the Persian Empire, but then there are later Greek additions that happened after Persia had met its match at the hands of Alexander the Great, and that's what we've been talking about here for the last couple of days. I'm just picking up right where we left off with that story from yesterday. If this seems abrupt, make sure you go back and catch yesterday's episode. It'll make more sense. So Alexandria is now the most Jewish city in the world, but Alexander the Great's Greekification efforts have been really successful. Everybody speaks Greek now. And even though there are tons of Jews in Alexandria who have synagogues and they're still deeply committed practitioners of Judaism, they're not very good at Hebrew. Hebrew's kind of gone away. Even back in Jerusalem, as we're getting into the 200s BC, one of the other languages that was prominent in Persia, Aramaic, has really caught on. And if somebody traveled to Jerusalem from Alexandria in the 2nd century BC, you'd be more likely to hear Greek or Aramaic than you would Hebrew. Hebrew still would have been used around the temple, but Greek would have been the trade language of the day. Aramaic would have been the local language. Well, in Egypt, this is pretty much just Greek all the time. So since the Jews are a people of the book, what are they supposed to do when most of the people can't read or understand the book in the language it's written in? And so you might say, well, they should have just made an effort to teach their children Hebrew. And they did. And that's always been a value of the Jews. But the reality of it is it fell into disuse for a very long period of time. And it's really relatively recently in history that it's seen its grand academic and modern daily use resurgence. This is just a consequence of living at the crossroads of ancient history and getting beat on by every single megapower and empire that comes and goes. Now, there are a whole bunch of legends about how this Greek translation of the Hebrew Old Testament happened, and those legends lend themselves to the name that this translation has, which is the Septuagint. I did a whole video on this. It covers a whole bunch of these details. I'm going to have Jeff link that down below if you want to go and learn more about it. Whatever the case, this translation process starts maybe somewhere in the very late 200s and really hits its stride in the 100s BC. And it was super, super popular. People use this all over the ancient world, and it gets referenced and quoted, this translation that is, a whole lot, but not exclusively in the New Testament as well. One of the books that got translated during this period is the book of Esther, but Esther didn't just get translated, it got added to. Why? Well, I think the biggest reason is that the pressures that the book of Esther was meant to address for its original audience back in Persia were no longer the pressures that readers of the book of Esther were feeling in this new late Greek, early Roman world of the 2nd century and inching on toward the 1st century BC. We talked a couple episodes ago about how the Hebrew version couples with Ezra and Nehemiah to really pay off what we get from the prophet Jeremiah about the role of Jews who are in exile. Live in a way that is redemptive and good and work for the benefit of your city and honor the king if you need to honor the king. And explicitly stated in Jeremiah's instructions is the reassurance that even though it feels like you've totally lost, I mean, you're in exile, you're defeated, you actually haven't, and God still has plans to prosper you and not to harm you. There's still a future here. The redemptive plan, the deal is still on, even though the sands of government are shifting during this time in exile. Well, fast forward a couple hundred years after Alexander the Great and everything else, and that's not really a question that the Jews are wrestling with anymore. Now they're wrestling with the question of how do they function alongside the other nations? Now, there's a very important historic detail here that you got to understand. The Greeks were starting to get pushy. They didn't like how standoffish the Jews were. The Persians, they didn't really care that much. I mean, Haman cared, but nobody else really cared. You just be Jewish, do your thing. And both Cyrus and Darius, well, and also Artaxerxes later were like, hey, go rebuild your temple, go rebuild your walls, be Jewish, knock yourselves out. That was how the Persians did things. But the Greeks didn't like that. They wanted the Jews to cooperate with their thing. So the Greeks were really hard on the Jews for the practice of circumcision. They were hard on the Jews for their dietary practices, for their refusal to worship more than one god. And it really came to a persecutorial head several times. In fact, ultimately, the Jews have a rebellion and defeat their Greek overlords a little bit later on here. So the pressing questions that the Jews are asking during the time of the Septuagint, the 2nd century, the 1st century BC, are just totally different than what they were asking and the pressures they were dealing with during the time of Persia. Well, now it comes time to translate the book of Esther from Hebrew into Greek, and she doesn't work as well anymore for what is needed in the minds of these translators. She isn't making any effort to separate herself from the Gentiles. There's no indication that she's honoring the dietary laws. She's just not a very good Jew at all by 2nd century BC Alexandrian Jewish cultural standards. She was a very difficult lady for them to look up to. And it's nice and all that the original Hebrew book of Esther kind of makes God out to be the hero. And I suppose it's a good message that God works through these very flawed people to accomplish his redemptive purposes, even in spite of who they are. But clearly, translators or authors whose work eventually made it into the hands of those Greek translators felt like Esther needed a facelift. Mordecai needs a facelift. They need to espouse more Jewish sensibilities, particularly about their separation from the rest of the world and their set-apartedness. So in these Greek editions, Esther is disgusted that she is married to a Gentile. Amongst whoever made these editions, there also seems to be a real discomfort with how the original Hebrew doesn't mention God. And the people responsible for these editions seem to really want to convey the idea that God was present and that he delivered the Jewish people because of the piety of the Jewish characters in the story. Well, that's obviously a very, very different message. In the Hebrew version that we are working our way through, the English translation of it, the Jews get saved because of God's providence in spite of everything about the difficult history of the Jewish people, and in spite of the flaws and the weaknesses of Esther and Mordecai. In the Hebrew version, God uses these incomplete people like you and me, to accomplish grand redemptive things. But again, with the later Greek editions, that Greek version makes it really clear that the Jews are saved because of the piety of Mordecai and Esther. Very different meanings. Next time around will be our last conversation in this little interlude between Esther 4 and Esther 5, where we've gone and looked at these later Greek editions and considered what they mean, and then we'll pick it back up in chapter 5. But tomorrow I want to actually look at some of these editions and read some of them to you so that you can get a sense of how that story flows firsthand a bit more instead of just taking my word for it. Cool. I'm Matt. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour podcast. Let's do this again soon.